Part 54. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 538. What's going on with those funny guys? Did they get punched in the wall by ghosts? Fatty said while looking at them, but his brows quickly furrowed. Obviously, Fatty saw that things were not that simple. No, it doesn't look like ghosts hitting the wall. Gyatso directly denied the fat man's guess at this time. Did you notice that although they were just walking in circles in one place, it didn't look like they were walking around on their own initiative and unconsciously? The ground was circling in circles, more like it was being driven by a group of invisible things. It was like a group of lambs being teased by wolves. The monk took Gyatso's words at this time, but at the same time he frowned slightly. Fat man, let's set up a peeping formation together and take a closer look at the nuclear power plant. What on earth is there? Monk, do you doubt that from where we are standing now, when we look at the nuclear power plant, we are actually just seeing a false illusion? The fat man asked while taking out his array props. What surprised the fat man was that if he wanted to construct an illusion magic circle that would confuse people from any position from far away, how big of a scene would that be? And what is to be hidden is not a person, but a nuclear power plant covering a large area. This is simply a huge project. Damn it, monk, if it's really an illusion, it would be terrible, the fat man muttered while arranging the magic circle. The monk nodded, which meant that the monk himself felt the same way. The two people did not arrange the magic circle separately, but the monk helped and assisted, while the fat man made the main arrangement. Subai and Gyatso stood aside, looking at the nuclear power plant below from time to time. To be honest, I'm a bit looking forward to it, Subai said with a smile. Gyatso nodded, same. Soon, the fat man's formation was arranged. He immediately made a secret and ran the formation. A blue aperture of about 1 square meter appeared. The fat man pointed his finger at the aperture. The aperture moved with the fat man's finger. When the fat man adjusted the aperture, after getting a good angle, looking at the scene from the aperture position, the fat man swallowed subconsciously. The monk stood beside the fat man, his expression suddenly serious. Subai and Gyatso looked at each other and walked over. Soon, Subai understood the reason why the fat man and the monk were so close to each other. In Subai's opinion, this aperture should have the effect of breaking away demonic barriers and illusions, allowing the essence of contrast to be seen. Looking through the aperture, the top of the nuclear power plant was covered by a black cover, and inside the nuclear power plant, there were countless people standing densely packed. Fat man, you may be right, this is really a mass grave, Subai said. Haha, the fat man laughed dryly. At this time, he was not at all proud of the accuracy of the prediction, because according to the consistent nature of the broadcast, the main mission of himself and others would definitely not be able to bypass this nuclear power plant. Those people are not living corpses, or they don't seem to be in that pure material state, the monk analyzed. Look, when the listeners were running around, their bodies passed directly through the corpses. Then these corpses are local Korean residents nearby, Subai asked. Judging from the clothing and age composition of the people, it should be so, the monk replied, but the poor monk doesn't know why they are in such a state. At this time, Gyatso touched his hatchet with one hand and said, it may be that the powerful radiation changed the bodies of these people into another state, or in other words, another medium. Gyatso, why do I always feel a little weird when listening to you, a Tibetan eminent monk, talk about science fiction, the fat man muttered. This is just a transformation of material existence, just like the existence of hell, heaven, and heaven in myths and legends. In fact, these places may not be in the so-called heaven or underground. They may be in the human world, or they may be in the world next to a certain hotel. It is just because we are in different spatial dimensions, so it cannot be seen and entered by ordinary people. Gyatso paused. There are actually many records of this statement in the Tantric classics. You mean that the entire area of the nuclear power plant has entered another dimension? Although it is still in place, we can no longer see its current essence with the naked eye. The same goes for so many corpses of residents, Subai asked. That should be the case, I'm not sure, Gyatso said. Actually, there is a way to be sure. The fat man looked at the three people around him, but there is no need for us to rush there ourselves. Let's see what the condition of those people is first, and see if they can come out, or will he die? Yes, nuclear power plants are an absolutely dangerous place. It is a fact that is obvious. There is really no need for everyone to enter this tiger's den now. Moreover, there are listeners inside, who can just observe their ending and process. At this moment, in the woods not far away, violent energy fluctuations suddenly occurred, and there was also a faint explosion. I'll go take a look. Subai looked at the others. You continue to observe here. Don't be impulsive, just take a look. If something happens, send a signal and we will pay attention there, the fat man warned Subai. Subai nodded, indicating that he knew what to do, and then ran towards the forest. Due to the strong nuclear radiation, this large area has actually become a wasteland, and the forest has basically withered, but it still has the ability to block the view. Subai stopped after walking about 8 or 9 kilometers. The previous violent energy fluctuations had disappeared, which meant that a conflict might have ended. When Subai pushed aside the dead branches in front of him, he saw a large open space of about tens of square meters in front of him. This was an open space swept out directly by the energy aura. All gone. Subai thought to himself. There were still blood stains on the ground. Subai walked over, stretched out his finger, tapped the blood stain, placed it on the tip of his tongue, and tasted it. It is the blood of seniors. Subai looked around. He shouldn't have gone far yet. Just when Subai was hesitating whether to continue searching or return, a scream came from the 6 o'clock direction, and at the same time, a strong smell of blood filled the air. Subai took a deep breath and looked at where Fatty and the others were. Based on the distance calculation, if something went wrong on his side, Fatty and the others should have time to provide support. Subai began to slowly walk towards that location. Judging from the concentration of the smell of blood in the air, it should not be far from him. Sure enough, after walking less than 100 meters, a small steep slope appeared in front. The slope of the steep slope was not large, and the depth was not large. In this mountain forest, it can only be regarded as a very shallow twist and twist. Maybe it used to be here. There was supposed to be a small stream, but it's now apparently dead and dry. A woman with only half her body left was hung on a branch, her body swaying gently back and forth with the branches. Below, the blood dripping from the female corpse slowly accumulated and soaked the ground. Subai couldn't help but licked his lips. It was such a waste to waste blood like this, which was the blood of a senior person. At the bottom of the slope, there was a man lying there. The man's arms had been cut off and were missing. However, the man was still breathing and his chest was still heaving. He was not dead yet. Judging from the details of the scene and the injuries of the man and woman, both of them were victims and there was no murderer. Subai walked down and stood beside the man. The man's strength was a little weaker. He probably didn't have the fusion weapon. He could only be said to be close to the strength of a veteran. At this time, his chest was heaving violently. He opened his eyes and looked at Subai standing in front of him, with a look in his eyes. With a look of supplication, his lips pursed, and he uttered a few syllables with difficulty. "Help me, save me. Save you. Maybe." Subai had no reaction. In fact, this reaction should be the normal reaction of the audience in the story world. Whether it is the real world or the story world, there will be no such thing as we listeners are all living Lei Feng. Click. Behind Subai, there was a crisp sound. Subai turned around. More than 20 meters away from me, stood a woman. The woman has chestnut hair, wears a white dress, and a pair of white leather boots. She is both heroic and weak, charming and heroic. The seemingly contrasting combination reflects a very harmonious look on her. A feeling of the skin that can be broken, the light blue eyes, the delicate bridge of the nose, the alluring red lips, every bit by bit, interpret the most perfect proportions of women. It's sexy with a hint of playfulness, just the right taste. It's beautiful, really beautiful, not the kind of rigid and meticulous beauty, but a natural beauty. Even young Master Su, who has read countless beauties, couldn't help but shine when he first saw it. The perfect figure of this Western woman paired with the classical temperament of an Eastern woman is really a miracle of the Creator. Such a beautiful audience, Subai is really rare to see. While Subai was looking at the woman wantonly, the woman seemed to be looking at Subai with great interest. Japanese, the woman asked with a cute cunning look in her eyes. Chinese, Subai replied. Oh, Chinese. The woman's Chinese was a little jerky and not very fluent. Then, the woman raised her left hand. She was holding a palm in her hand. The palm should come from the man with a broken arm at Subai's feet. Do you want to eat it? After saying that, the woman bit off a finger from her palm, turned her lovely red lips as if she were eating chicken feet, and then gently spit out the bone. At this time, Subai suddenly coughed, shook his head and said, "Just finished eating." Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 539. Seeing that Subai was not interested in her food, the woman didn't react at all. She just bit off a finger bone from the hand in her hand, and then gently took the finger bone out of her mouth with the other hand. There was no trace of skin and flesh on it, and the woman chewed it carefully, as if she was tasting the most unique delicacy in the world, even with a shyness unique to a beautiful woman. It was really embarrassing to eat in front of a strange man. There was a drop of blood remaining at the corner of the woman's mouth. Subai glanced there twice. This drop of blood seemed to be a heart-wrenching beauty mark, adding a lot of color to this perfect face. At this time, she actually had a kind of enchanting beauty similar to Medusa. The woman seemed to be aware of this, and looked at Subai apologetically for her eating appearance. Her cute and flexible tongue stretched out and licked back the drop of blood, just like licking off the strawberry jam on her lips. With a lovely air. Subai smiled slightly and stood there, watching her eat. The woman was enjoying the food by herself and didn't care about Subai, a spectator. After a while, she seemed to be satisfied and pointed at a corpse on the ground and the seriously injured man. "Blood, it's up to you." Obviously, the woman saw that Subai was a vampire. She seemed to be only interested in some organs of the human body. She was not very interested in blood. Of course, she didn't dislike it either. Subai couldn't figure out what kind of enhancement this Western woman had, because her aura was always in a fluctuating state. Sometimes it was a stressful atmosphere among seniors, and sometimes it was like an ordinary listener who had just been strengthened. It was very unstable. However, there is one detail that can be roughly inferred, that is, since this woman dared to act alone, instead of forming a team, and even started hunting for her own food here, it is enough to show that she has absolute reliance. According to Subai's speculation, this woman does not actually rely on eating the flesh of other powerful people in the audience to recover from her injuries or improve her strength. Perhaps, she just simply likes to eat human flesh. This is called necrophagia. It was previously estimated that this woman she is just trying her luck in the real world or buying some fresh corpses to eat. After becoming an audience, she should be similar to Subai. Ordinary people's meat can no longer satisfy her taste buds and soul, so her natural requirements for meat are a rising tide lifts all boats. Subai shook his head and indicated that he didn't need it now. Unless he was injured or felt very uncomfortable, Subai rarely took the initiative to touch blood. For Subai, the bloodline was more of a tool. It is not a belief, which is very different from Japanese and Korean audiences. That is really such a waste. The woman walked up to Subai and looked at the seriously injured man at her feet. Only in the story world can we eat their meat unscrupulously, but there is no refrigerator here. Subai opened his palms, and a cloud of cold white air rose up from Subai's palms. This was zombie cold poison. The woman felt the chill, with a look of joy on her face, and nodded excitedly to Subai, "Can you help me freeze them? I think I can have a chance to eat a second meal." White chi flowed down from Subai's palm, and the man who was not dead yet and the torn female corpse were frozen. "Thank you, can I know your name?" The woman came closer to Subai, and a gentle fragrance came from her body, as if it was an incense. This woman is really an absolute contradiction. Many contradictory things appeared to her at the same time. Subai. Emma. The woman stretched out her hand and gently rubbed Subai's chin, feeling the strength of the beard on Subai's chin. She was really a seductive temptress. Judging from her age, this woman may have looked like a college student. There was a label on her skirt that looked like a college student's school badge. As for which university it was, Subai didn't know, and he didn't have the knowledge to remember it like this. In fact, in both Eastern and Western universities, there will always be those coquettish girls who have another side that is unknown to the public, such as working in public relations outside or simply working on the periphery, and then there is often an infatuated man in the school who loves her affectionately. Waiting for her, but this one looks more extreme. I guess the boys who have a crush on her may not have even dreamed of her cannibalistic side. Subai reached out, grabbed Emma's hand, and moved it away from his chin. To be honest, Subai didn't hate this woman named Emma, and even the scene of her eating human flesh was nothing to Subai. However, Subai still rejected this overly intimate behavior, as if since he became an audience member, he has not touched a woman again. As a Taoist priest, the fat man often finds some young ladies to eat meat, but Subai never takes a step beyond the limits. It is not that Subai restrains his selfish desires, but that because it is really difficult to find a woman who can satisfy him and be with him for a night, and Subai is always busy with things, so it is rare for him to have leisure time. "I am leaving." Emma stood there, watching Subai's retreating figure, with a sweet smile on her lips. Then, she spread her hands, and the two frozen corpses floated. "Go find a good place for you to store it." It seems that Emma still likes her own food more than she is interested in Subai. It's just a pity that Emma also wanted to taste the taste of the vampire with an oriental face. But he instinctively realized that Subai was not the kind of character to be trifled with, so he gave up. And Subai actually felt that the other party's eyes looking at him contained a kind of exquisite food. Regarding this, Subai could only smile knowingly from the bottom of his heart. This woman named Emma was really good to a certain extent. It's somewhat similar to myself. When I see a strong man, my first reaction is, wouldn't his blood be very sweet? Those people, why are they still spinning around? They are really capable. My hands are sore from maintaining the formation. The fat man sighed and complained that it was actually the three people who were circling in the nuclear power plant who hadn't stopped yet, didn't come out, and didn't die. They just kept circling around a relatively open area in the nuclear power plant. The monk and Gyatso stood next to the fat man and kept observing the movements of the people in the nuclear power plant. After a while, the monk said thoughtfully, "They seem to have discovered something. Have you noticed it? Although those people are still where they are, he has become more and more proficient in escaping and running in circles, and the location of each move has become more and more standardized, almost becoming the same." Gyatso nodded, "I must have discovered some pattern." As soon as he finished speaking, Gyatso's eyes suddenly focused, "There is one person missing." The monk and the fat man also showed serious expressions. About 5 minutes later, when the remaining two people went around the nuclear power plant again, one person was missing. "Now, Only one person is left there. Damn, have you found the real entrance? Those 3 people are not easy at all. They were expelled like the grandson at first, but now they actually find a way to enter. As the fat man spoke, you took a branch next to you and drew on the ground. The monk did not hesitate and stared at the location and direction of the last person running. He wanted to remember that person's route in his heart, so that he could be much more relaxed when waiting for others to enter the nuclear power plant. Also, those who dare to be the first to enter the nuclear power plant to test the water are definitely not stupid, and they definitely have great confidence in their own strength. At this time, Subai happened to come back. Seeing the fat man and the monk looking like they were facing a formidable enemy, he didn't bother them. After a while, the last person disappeared. The fat man came back to his senses and asked Subai while looking at the picture he had just drawn on the ground. Dabai, what's going on over there? One skirmish, one woman, killed 2 listeners. Hey, this bitch is so delicious. Oriental woman or Western woman? Don't talk about black women. Western woman. What does it look like? Quite good looking. Huh, the fat man raised his head and looked at Subai with some surprise. A woman who can be said to be good looking by our young master Su should be really good. Are you far away? Can you introduce me to her? The fat man rolled his eyes and shouted to the monk and Gyatso, brothers, do me a favor and subdue that little bitch to make me feel happy. Knowing that the fat man was just joking, Gyatso and the monk ignored him. Subai patted the fat man on the shoulder. I think you should be quite suitable for her. That's right, fat master, although I have a little more flesh on my body, I am very attractive as a man and can give women a great sense of security. This is an advantage that a skinny man like you, Dabai, cannot realize. The fat man patted the fat on his belly. Only a woman who truly knows how to appreciate men will feel that my model is really in line with her taste. It shows that this kind of woman is smart. She understands men, life, and taste. Subai smiled and said, she will also go to the nuclear power plant. I will introduce you to her then. One sentence the fat man was about to ask the monk how his recording was going. At this moment, the voice of the radio sounded in everyone's mind. Hello dear listeners. I'm sorry that I can't communicate and talk to you until now, but this is also because you have always been obsessed with being in the vendetta and killings in the peripheral areas and can't extricate yourself. If someone had entered the plant earlier, we should have been able to meet earlier. Main Mission 1 is released below. Main, line, any, kaka, hiss, kaka. After a vague sound of snowflakes, the sound of the radio disappeared. Subai, Fatty, Gyatso and the monk looked at each other in confusion. What's happening here? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 540. What does this mean? What does this mean? Did the radio announcer drink too much kumis? The fat man's eyes swept over everyone. Father, I drank too much kumis, and my ears are a little weak. I didn't hear anything about the main mission just broadcast. How can we be friends? The fat man shrugged, spread his hands, and spoke in a Xinjiang version of Mandarin. Obviously, this is a kind of ridicule, because it is impossible not to pay attention and not hear the sound of the broadcast clearly, because the broadcast is not so much talking to you with a llama in your ear. It is better to say that it is communicating with you from the bottom of your heart, so it is not there is such a thing as whether you can hear clearly or not. Is the broadcast signal blocked? Gyatso asked, because when he finally released the task, it was obvious that the signal when listening to the broadcast was too weak, causing the sound to be unclear. Subai smiled and said, then how do you explain that the radio announcer said everything smoothly before, but when it came to the most important point of releasing the main mission, He suddenly beeped, beeped, beeped. Is it because of the nuclear power plant that it affects the broadcasts? Fatty guessed, I heard that strong radiation does affect these. Hearing this, the monk shook his head and said, the radio won't be that weak. The fat man smiled when he saw the monk refuting him. In fact, he also agreed with the monk's statement that the radio would not be that weak because it was not just a radio telling horror stories. Then it must be the intention of the broadcaster. The fat man faced the nuclear power plant. He deliberately didn't tell us what the main task was, forcing us to run around like headless chickens. Haha, it's really interesting. Damn, it's worthy of being broadcast. Simply pursuing the so-called storytelling to the point of frenzy. What the fat man said should be almost the truth. In the story world, radio is the absolute master. This is the first true proposition, which cannot be discussed, refuted, or even doubted. So, it is basically certain that the broadcast was intentional. I felt something was wrong from the beginning. The main mission was not released at the beginning of the broadcast, and the degree of freedom in this story world was a little too high. I believe that not only here, but also in many places, conflicts among listeners broke out. Fighting, but this is not like a story world like the Roman duel, and there is no need to spend so much effort on broadcasting. Gyatso paused, pointed at the nuclear power plant, and said, I'm very curious now. Since we don't know the main mission, we naturally don't know the rewards and punishments. What are the rewards? Let's not look forward to it for now. As for the punishments, I'm really afraid that the punishment set by the broadcast is to wipe everyone out if the mission fails. But the current situation is that no matter what the punishment set by the broadcast is, whether it is serious enough to be wiped out if the mission fails, we can only consider the worst result. The monk took a deep breath, and we can't do it anymore. I sat motionless, just in case the broadcast set a deadline for completing the task. Sometimes, the unknown is the biggest source of fear, and the radio perfectly explained this point this time. Then let's go down, the fat man suggested. Look, there are several energy auras over there. It's probably that people like us who were sitting on the Diaotai just watching the fire from the other side can't calm down anymore. This is for sure. No matter how firmly you sit on the Diaotai, your own life is definitely not as important. Although at this time, you can continue to let others rush in front and push back from behind, but no one is stupid, and no one is willing to risk his or her wealth or life. Joke. Sudbai and the four of them naturally went down the slope together and walked directly to the nuclear power plant. About a quarter of an hour later, the four of them stood at the entrance of the nuclear power plant. At this time, there were other people at the nuclear power plant, 2 teams. One was a team composed of Chinese listeners besides Sudbai's team. There were 5 people in total. The leader seemed to know the fat man. But the fat man looked at him with a deep sense of wariness. Obviously, there was no need to say anything more. The person who could make people like Fatty be deeply wary and even not use excuses was obviously not a kind person. Stubble. The other one was the Western team, which also had 5 people. The leader was a man in a red suit. The man was slender and wore a clown mask on his face, but his eyes focused on Sudbai for a while. Sudbai could also sense a similar aura from his body. Obviously, the other party is probably also a blood race enhancer, and he can actually bring an invisible pressure on his bloodline inheritance, which means that the other party's bloodline level is still higher than his own. There were also 2 individual visitors. One was Emma, a cannibal patient that Sudbai had seen. Emma stood there, independent, with a beautiful temperament, giving people a feeling that she subconsciously wanted to take care of her. The other one is a middle-aged Japanese man wearing a kimono and wooden clogs and a wooden sword tied around his waist. Everyone gathered quietly at the gate of the nuclear power plant, and the scene seemed very quiet. Sudbai poked the fat man's shoulder and motioned the fat man to look at Emma over there. Dabai, She is really beautiful. The fat man immediately looked like a pig. As if she noticed the fat man's gaze, Emma glanced at the fat man specially. That look was very charming. Oh 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 oh. Fatty suddenly felt a tingling sensation and whispered to Subai, "What should I do, Dabai? I feel like I fell in love at first sight." She has necrophagia. Didn't you see that those Westerners didn't dare to get too close to her? They all deliberately avoided her. The fat man rolled his eyes at Subai, looking like "I hate you." The monk clasped his hands together at this time and said, "Amitabha, the poor monk has the real road map to enter here. If any of you have observed it, you can compare it with the poor monk now." The monk actually compared himself with the fat man before. The difference is not big, but there is still a little difference. When the time comes, a little difference may lead to very embarrassing consequences. I have it here. The leader of another Chinese team, the one that Fatty was very afraid of, came out with a piece of paper in his hand with pencil marks on it. The marks on the paper looked very meticulous. "His name is Munan, nicknamed Lao Yinbai," the fat man whispered to Subai. Subai looked at the fat man in surprise and said, "The person who makes you think he is Lao Yinbai looks really scary." Exactly, the key to this guy is that he has great intelligence and layout ability, but he always likes to resort to dirty tricks. "Even the monk looks more upright than him," the fat man muttered. "Then he is a wise man?" Subai asked. "More or less, a wise man who likes to go down the wrong path. The monk over there was comparing the route map with that Munan." The other people here were either standing there as if looking at the scenery and observing the surroundings, or they were communicating in low voices, and they all deliberately arranged a simple shielding layer during the communication. Boundary. The main mission is unknown, which is unknown to everyone. Therefore, prompted by this fear of the unknown, the audience standing here now subconsciously put aside other thoughts and entered the nuclear power plant together first, striving to complete the main mission. Let's clarify the ideas inside and then talk about other things. If anyone is making trouble at this time, there is a risk of being beaten. Emma smiled sweetly at this time, and took the initiative to walk over to Subai. She put one hand on Subai's arm, and leaned against Subai, with a bit of a Western woman's plump figure pressed against Subai's. On his body, Subai's arms could still touch the soft elasticity. "Dear Su, I am so scared. Can you protect me?" The broken Chinese sounds more fragile when spoken. Of course, anyone who saw her eating raw human flesh and eating human fingers like chicken feet would probably not have any feelings of pity and love for her. However, Subai seems to be a different kind. He is really not disgusted with Emma's quirks, because everyone is the eldest brother and does not laugh at the second brother. "Do you want to join our team?" Subai asked. "What do you think?" There was a hint of expectation in Emma's eyes, but this woman gave people an impenetrable feeling in terms of character and decision-making. No one knew whether she really wanted to join the squad. "You can join, but I can't guarantee that you will be tricked to death by our team," Subai said honestly. Emma's eyes swept over the monk, Gyatso, and the fat man who were talking to Munan in turn. I took a few more focused glances at the fat man. This made the fat man suddenly feel a chill on his back and shiver. "Then forget it." Emma shook her head gently. The monk and Munan checked the route, and each side signaled to the people on their side. One group of people began to walk into the gate of the nuclear power plant, and the Western team and the Japanese old man also followed them consciously. As soon as you walk through the door, Subai suddenly felt that the temperature around him suddenly dropped. The coldness that penetrated the skin made Subai tremble subconsciously. "Dabai," the fat man noticed Subai's abnormality and leaned next to Subai unobtrusively to ask about the situation. Subai shook his head. He wanted to say that he was fine, but suddenly, some pictures appeared in Subai's mind. In that picture, he was standing in a place, watching the nuclear power plant in front of him explode, and a mushroom cloud was produced. The scorching temperature and the accompanying terrible radiation completely enveloped itself. Where were you standing at that time? Because the broadcast is fast-forwarding, on the one hand, it makes Subai feel very vague about those 30 years of experience. On the other hand, of course, it also reduces Subai's painful time, because the broadcast is also afraid that Subai will not be able to bear it for 3 years. After 10 years of radiation pain, he committed suicide, which affected the progress of normal story missions. However, this scene happened to be in the slide-like memory fragment. At that time, it seemed that I was standing here and witnessed the explosion of the nuclear power plant. Subai turned around and walked back to the entrance. The fat man and the monk also stopped and looked at Subai. Some other people also stopped and paid attention to Subai's behavior. It's here. Yes. It's here. This location overlaps with the image in my memory fragment. Subai immediately squatted down. On the concrete floor at the entrance of the gate, he saw an English word carved with his fingernails. Out. Did you write this yourself? Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 541. Out. Subai gently placed his finger on Yin Jishang and rubbed it. Is this a message mark left by him? Subai himself was not sure about this. Seeing that Subai had been squatting there, the fat man immediately walked over and saw the English word at Subai's feet. At the same time, he subconsciously moved his body slightly to the left to block other people's eyes. Out, this word, generally means out and outside. At this time, seeing this word, Fatty looked at Subai with some confusion and asked. What does it mean? Subai shook his head, I don't know. He really didn't know, and Subai didn't make any concealment. Although his body had been radiated for 30 years, he should have entered here 30 years earlier than other listeners, but because the broadcast sped up the process, so I only retained a little bit of memory scenes, but in fact, when Subai was really awake and had the ability to act on his own, it was also the time when Fatty and the others entered the story world through normal channels. It can be said that to a certain extent, everyone is entering the story world together. After all, it is impossible for the radio to allow Subai to stay here with self-awareness for 30 years. First, he is worried that Subai will not be able to bear the pain of 30 years and cannot think about suicide. Second, because if Subai cannot think about it, but if you think too much, then, 30 years, even if there is no opportunity, even if the injury is serious, it is enough to cause a qualitative transformation in an audience. Even if Subai sits there motionless and thinks about it for 30 years, he will definitely make great progress. This is equivalent to giving Subai a huge bug, so the broadcast will not allow this kind of thing to happen. Others, after being in the real world for a while, you are immediately pulled into the story world without stopping. It is very urgent, but you suddenly have 30 years of extra time to come out. This is because Subai is a vampire. If Subai were a Taoist priest or another cultivator, this bug would definitely be even more exaggerated. Are you sure it was you who left it behind? Fatty knew about Subai's punishment, so he also guessed whether it was left behind by Subai. It's still not clear. Subai stood up. It has been 30 years, and this mark has become a little blurry. I can't confirm whether it was left by me through the details. It may be a prank, or it may be a deliberate arrangement. They came out to confuse us. But what if it's really you who was 30 years ago? The fat man shrugged. Even if you press fast forward for 30 years, even if you quickly lie down in the coffin in the prop shop and fall asleep, even if your consciousness and memory are deliberately broadcast to speed up, it is undeniable that you have indeed stayed in this story world for 30 years longer than us, and have truly stayed here for 30 years. No matter whether the time flow rate of the story world changes or not, you are actually in a relatively static state relative to the story world. What the broadcast erases are the accidents that may have occurred to you in the past 30 years, whether they are good accidents or bad accidents. Accident. So, "What do you want to say?" Subai looked into the fat man's eyes and asked. "Babai, what I want to say is, if this is really the message you left 30 years ago, then should we exit this nuclear power plant now instead of continuing to risk going in? Or even continue to go get into its true colors?" Just based on this word, Subai laughed, because he didn't have the confidence himself. The fat man took a deep breath and let it out heavily. At this time, because Subai and the fat man were delayed in the same place, the monk naturally stayed there and did not leave. As a result, everyone stopped in place and looked here suspiciously. However, no one came over to ask what they had found out of curiosity. Although everyone maintained a harmonious situation on the surface, they all knew that even when the main mission was unknown, there was actually more competition between them, which was necessary. Privacy and information must exist alone. Subai stepped on it and left a footprint on the cement floor, erasing the English word directly. After looking at each other at Fatty, Subai followed, and Fatty followed immediately. Subai didn't know whether this was a message he left behind, but he instinctively felt that even when he was first thrown into the story world of nuclear explosions 30 years ago, he would not be able to foresee 30 years. It is impossible to guess what will happen next, and what the main mission of the broadcast is. The most likely thing is that he knows that the danger here may have exceeded the level of ordinary nuclear radiation. The monk began to lead everyone to circle, just like the first 3 people who entered the circle before. "Dabai, pay attention. This circle is not a regular walk. This may vary depending on the height and even fatness and gender of each person. Pay attention to the intensity and angle of the surrounding light. Don't look specifically at the monk's face. Underfoot, that's a cover-up." The fat man first whispered something to Gyatso, and then reminded him again next to Subai. "Blindfold. If this is the case, then the so-called comparison road map between the monk and Munan was actually just a cover?" On Subai's side, the only ones who are really proficient in formations are the monk and the fat man. These 2 people should have discovered the clues when they arrived on the ground. The previous road map was indeed correct, but it was not entirely correct. It should only fit the last of the 3 people before it, nothing more. Then, Munan must be aware of it. "So, are you planning to get rid of Emma, the Japanese old man, and the Western team?" The monk started to circle, followed by Subai, Fatty, and Gyatso, followed by Munan's 5-person team, and the rest followed suit. After a circle, the monk disappeared in front of Subai. Subai became the first one, and soon after, someone from Munan's team also disappeared. The fat man put his hand on Subai's shoulder and motioned Subai to do it again. Obviously, the monk left first to explore the way, while Munan planned to take the people in his team away one by one. Otherwise, if he went in first, now, the other 4 members of the team haven't come in, so there's no point in him being just a polished commander. Subai nodded and began to pay attention to the changes in light and shadow around him. In fact, there was a road map for reference, and coupled with the monk's previous demonstration, Subai slowly found that feeling. That kind of. When the line of sight forms a certain angle with the surrounding horizontal plane, it is gray and has a bit of astigmatism. Subai just followed this angle and this feeling and continued walking. Gradually, Subai found that his eyes began to gradually become blurry, along with everything around him. A hand stretched out and grabbed Subai. Subai subconsciously prepared to fight back. It was almost his instinct. Amitabha. The Buddha's trumpet sounds. Subai immediately put away his energy, took a step to the side, and his eyes suddenly opened up. The surroundings were still as they were before, but the sky was completely dark. In the sky, there was a blood-colored full moon, as if a huge eyeball was hanging on it and watching everything. And beside him and the monk, there was another Chinese, one of Munan's team. Next, Gyatso also came in, followed by Fatty, and 4 people also came in from Munan's side, and finally Munan came in. As for Emma and the other 7, they seemed to be intercepted outside. It's difficult to handle more people. Munan seemed to notice Sudbai's eyes sizing him up, and smiled at Sudbai, with a touch of warmth and magnanimity in his smile. However, Sudbai still remembered the fat man's description of him, so he would not be fooled by Munan's appearance. Moreover, in this place, with 4 of them together, if Munan can still figure him out, it means that this guy is really a monster to the extreme. There seems to be no change in the surroundings, except for the darkness and the blood moon. However, if you think about it carefully, you can still find the differences. Diagonally in front of everyone, there was a cylindrical building, and at the entrance below, dozens of firefighting suits were neatly stacked. Because people are not lying there wearing them, it is really difficult to notice the difference at first. The monk looked at Munan, who smiled and walked forward on his own initiative. The 4 people in his team also walked forward with him. This time, Sudbai and 4 others followed behind. When he was approaching the cylindrical building, Sudbai looked back and saw that Emma and the others had not entered yet. At this time, Sudbai suddenly felt a little weird. Is it because no one understands the formation and can't see that the circuit diagram needs to be fine-tuned for each person, so they can't get in? Or are they waiting on purpose and not coming in yet? Dozens of firefighting suits were neatly stacked there, and people were walking through them. For some reason, Sudbai suddenly felt slightly dizzy. Haha, I thought it was a mutated magic weapon with a super strong radiation concentration. A disdainful voice came from Munan's team. A young man in a black coat reached out and picked up a set of firefighting uniforms stacked on the ground. After looking at them, he looked very disappointed and threw the firefighting uniforms casually. The ground was thrown to the ground. When the firefighting suit fell to the ground, the expressions of Fatty, Monk and Munan suddenly changed. Sudbai covered his head with one hand, feeling dizzy and nauseated suddenly coming over him. Immediately afterwards, Sudbai saw cracks suddenly appearing on the body of the man who had just thrown off his firefighting uniform. Then his skin began to peel off from his body, and his flesh and bones were also directly separated. The spleen, vagina, and other organs all fell to the ground. Click. The man with only the skeleton left fell to his knees on the ground. The vitality disappears immediately. A great terror. It was enveloped so unexpectedly. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 542. A senior person died like this? This scene made everyone present fall silent for a moment. Even the monk and Munan were unable to recover for a moment. The 2 extremely thoughtful guys who like to calculate all possibilities did not expect that. All this will come so easily. Sudbai took a deep breath and shook his head. The dizziness in his head finally disappeared. He looked at the almost perfectly dissected corpse on the ground. Bones, skin, flesh, organs, and organs were stacked there. He was as meticulous as the firefighting uniforms carefully placed around him. Munan raised his hand and said, "Nonsense, don't touch these firefighting suits." This is an obvious nonsense, because with the lesson learned by the young man in black, no one here will touch those firefighting suits anymore. But then, Munan himself slowly squatted down in front of a firefighting suit. At the same time, he stretched out his hand. It seemed that he planned to pick up the firefighting suit. The monk's eyes narrowed, the fat man's eyes narrowed, Gyatso's breathing became slower, and Sudbai subconsciously put his hand on his forehead again. That dizzy feeling seems to be coming again. Damn. It seemed that he must have been here 30 years ago. What exactly did he experience here 30 years ago, Sudbai thought to himself. The remaining 3 people in Munan's team subconsciously took a few steps back when they saw Munan behaving like this. The reason why they gathered together was because of Munan's reputation in the Chinese audience circle. Of course, people like Sudbai who were almost too lazy to socialize had never heard of Munan's reputation. The rest of the people were different. How could a character that even fat people are afraid of be an unknown person? But despite this, the remaining people in his team were extremely puzzled by Munan's actions at this time. Immediately afterwards, Munan began to speak a string of Korean words, as if he was praying devoutly. There was a sense of tragedy and responsibility in his words, which was very exaggerated, really exaggerated. "What is he talking about?" the fat man came to Subai and asked. "I don't understand Korean," Subai replied. Oh, the fat man nodded and went to the monk and Gyatso. Obviously, the monk and Gyatso didn't understand Korean. Everyone knew English. The monk and Gyatso also knew some things related to Buddhism. Language, such as Sanskrit, but for Korean, it was obvious that the four people present knew nothing about it. The remaining three people in Munan's team obviously didn't know what Munan was doing. In short, everyone was in a state of confusion. For a moment, Munan's actions formed a sharp contrast with the reactions of the people around him. Subai really felt like he had become the background this time. Well, it's hard to miss a book when it's time to use it. It seems that Fatty will have to take a language training class after finishing the story world. He has to learn Japanese, Korean, and the like, and he also needs to get better at English. It seems that the fat man has indeed been greatly stimulated. Watching others pretending to be cool, you are confused next to him, and you don't even know what others are pretending to be, but you feel that it is very powerful. This is for a person who always considers himself smart. For fat people, it is really difficult to accept. Soon, Munan ended the prayer-like ceremony. You could see that he hesitated for a moment, then reached out and picked up the firefighting suit in front of him. For a time, everyone present held their breath. Some people even had the image of Munan being skinned and flayed in their minds. But, all this didn't happen. Munan stood up and put on his firefighting uniform. Then, he looked at the entrance of the cylindrical building in front of him. That should be the real key place of the nuclear power plant and also the place of danger. However, Munan did not move forward in a hurry, but glanced at Subai and others as well as the remaining people in his team. "He is hesitating," Subai said. The fat man nodded, indicating that he had noticed it, and added, "He hesitates whether to continue taking a few lay scapegoats with him." However, soon, Munan stopped thinking too much and walked directly to the entrance. The door was open, so he walked directly in. This is just like a puzzle game, with one link within another. The fat man reached out and scratched his hair speechlessly. The monk and Gyatso looked at each other, and both of them could see the look of understanding in the other's eyes. In fact, at this point, it doesn't matter whether Munan explains or not, whether he talks or not. Everyone present is smart. In fact, I made a rough guess. Whose firefighting suits belong to them? Obviously, it should be the firefighters who came to rescue the disaster when the nuclear power plant first encountered problems 30 years ago, but their people disappeared, or the bodies disappeared. This is also a normal thing. After all, the nearest to the nuclear power plant, all the people in a county were also missing. But there is still something in the dark. No, to be precise, maybe the consciousness of the original firefighters still remains here and is still guarding it. Subai once saw the terrifying power of 2,000 dead souls fused into one body in the world of punishment stories. At that time, he and the other two punished listeners spent almost all their strength to kill them. This was still the reason is that the other party deliberately set up a bug after being broadcast and only knew to chase one person first and kill the others without caring about the others. But this time, there are estimated to be tens of thousands of dead souls in the county. First of all, the number of dead souls is in the sky and on the ground. In addition, there is also the impact of nuclear radiation. God knows what kind of terrifying power these dead souls will release when they gather here, killing instantly. For an ordinary veteran, it is really as easy as crushing an ant to death. Dabai, Don't you realize that senior people are becoming less and less valuable? The fat man said sadly. Yes, first on the train platform, 30 senior people were killed by sarcoma, and in this story world, senior people continued to die. Although Fatty himself was also a member of the killing, it doesn't stop him from being too sad. Senior people have gradually become a consumable, including the fat man himself. Maybe it's because as your strength increases, the difficulty of the story world you face also increases. Subai guessed. Of course, there may also be broadcasters who want to expand their audience size and boost their metabolism. This is not a difficult problem for radio. It only needs to expand the number of experiencers. When the lower base is expanded, the number of low-level listeners, senior listeners, and even high-level listeners will naturally increase. Munan left and went to the cylindrical building alone. The 3 people who had found a way to enter here before probably also entered. As soon as he thought about this, Subai suddenly thought of something. Fat man, do you still remember what those 3 people look like? It's so far away and we're on the mountain, so we can't see clearly, but I can tell they are white. Can all 3 white people understand Korean? Subai asked again. The fat man understood immediately, and the monk and Gyatso standing nearby also woke up immediately. Yes. I and others were still struggling with the big problem of Korean before, but now it seems that language is not a problem at all. Amitba, this poor monk is in darkness this time regarding soul communication. The monk and the fat man actually have the most say, because their strength is to often deal with ghosts. The monk immediately put his hands together and saluted reverently to the fireman's uniform in front of him, just like Munan before him. You are heroes who sacrificed their lives on the front line to prevent nuclear leakage. Now, please allow this humble monk to inherit your mantle and continue to protect this place from being harmed by nuclear pollution on your behalf. Fatty and Gyatso each stood in front of a set of firefighting suits. At least they looked and sounded very pious and began to speak. Their meaning was roughly the same as that of a monk. They could say it as nicely as they wanted. In short, they had to say that they had taken this set of firefighting suits. There are many of you heroic spirits who can help you fulfill your unfinished wishes, so leave the burden to us. The 3 remaining Chinese audience members of Munan's team looked at each other, and each stood in front of a firefighting suit, copying what they were doing. Maybe, it just needs to be in this form. Otherwise, firefighting uniforms cannot be taken away. And this firefighting suit is obviously a necessary prop in the storyline and cannot be jumped over. If you want to jump over, if you dare to be disrespectful, the person who just died will be the best fate. Subai was also ready to find a firefighting suit and go through the motions. However, when he approached the area where the firefighting suits were piled, Subai suddenly felt that the dizziness on his forehead was getting deeper. He subconsciously took 2 steps back and found that the dizziness had returned. Much lower. Subai began to move slowly around several firefighting suits. Finally, Subai found a very suspicious place, which was one of the firefighting suits. The closer he got to it, the more dizzy he felt, and I have no feeling for the rest of the firefighting uniforms. That firefighting suit was the firefighting suit that was picked up by the man in black before. At this time, it was different from the other firefighting suits. It was relatively scattered and was thrown to the ground by the man in black. It was basically completely spread out. Ninja Subai felt a strong sense of dizziness and squatted down, carefully looking at the firefighting suit that made him feel very uncomfortable. On the chest of the firefighting suit, there was a special pool of yin hong, exuding a smell that made Subai so familiar that he could no longer be familiar with it. This is my own blood. 30 years ago, my own blood. At this time, the monk, Fatty, Gyatso and the other 3 audience members had finished praying and were ready to reach out for the firefighting suit praying in front of them. Subai did not pray, but took the firefighting uniform in front of him in his hand. Then, Sudbai's body shook violently and shouted. Don't move, you've fallen into a trap. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 543. Don't move, you've fallen into a trap. However, Sudbai's shout still came a little late, or in other words, it was not timely enough. Gyatso's hand had already been placed on the firefighting suit in front of him, and the other three audience members had also picked up the firefighting suit in front of them. Only the monk and the fat man hesitated for a moment after praying, but if Sudbai had shouted a few seconds later, their hands would have definitely touched the firefighting suits in front of them. Gyatso put his palms against the fireman's suit, and his expression suddenly twitched. When Sudbai shouted these words, he knew that the matter was serious. The other three listeners who were originally under Munan also looked surprised. Next moment, Gyatso felt a tingling sensation coming from the center of his eyebrows. Then, a blood line appeared from the center of his eyebrows to the bottom of his body. Then, before Gyatso had time to react, the flesh on his body fell from both sides. It was cut open, leaving only the black and golden white bones standing there. And Gyatso's aura completely disappeared at this time. The bodies of the other three listeners were also cut into pieces. Their skin and flesh, their bones and their organs were all split apart and scattered all over the floor. The fat man swallowed subconsciously and looked at Gyatso's bones on the ground. A sense of horror suddenly came over him. The fat man did not expect that Gyatso, who he had known for so long and even lived with him day and night under the same roof for a long time, would just die like that. Not even a chance to resist? Not even a chance to shout? The fat man felt so aggrieved. He felt aggrieved for Gyatso, and at the same time, he felt aggrieved for Gyatso. For a moment, the surrounding temperature seemed to have dropped a lot, which also reflected the mentality of the three people who were still alive at this time. The monk closed his eyes and forcibly suppressed the uneasiness and fear in his mind. He did not allow such emotions to appear in him, and at the same time at such a critical moment. Immediately afterwards, the monk looked at Sudbai, lowered his voice, and asked, "Dabai, there is still a turning point, right?" The fat man, who was originally full of indignation, immediately showed a look of surprise when he heard the monk's words, and looked at Sudbai. "Dabai, that's not what happened, is it? Impossible, impossible. Let the 5 veterans die so neatly and without any resistance, even if this is a game, even if the price of violating the game is death, it is impossible for so many people to die in one go. This is not in line with the aesthetics of broadcasting." Yes, Fatty finally discovered the problem after being reminded by the monk. Broadcasting has a quirk of pursuing stories, which can even be said to be a kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder. 5 senior listeners died all of a sudden because of this damn rule? This is too wasteful. It's not that senior listeners can't die, but just like bunches of fireworks, throwing them into water is also a kind of consumption and end. However, the normal approach should be to ignite them so that they can emit momentary light, fire, and sound, although the final end, in fact, it is no different from throwing it in the water. It becomes a pile of garbage. Senior listeners can die, but they should die more exciting, right? Sudbai still held the firefighting suit in his hand and pointed to the blood stains on the chest of the firefighting suit. "This is my blood." "Is it the blood you left 30 years ago?" The monk narrowed his eyes and asked, "Can't you extract memories from the blood? Can you try to extract the memories from 30 years ago from the blood now?" Sudbai heard this and shook his head. "That has a prerequisite, that is, I can find a few more drops of blood essence similar to Essayist's ancient vampires as a primer, otherwise I wouldn't be able to complete it now. This kind of thing." Hearing what Sudbai said, the monk's eyes showed disappointment, but soon, The monk seemed to finally catch up with Sudbai's thoughts, because he thought of what Sudbai said before, he had fallen into a trap. For a time, countless thoughts collided in the monk's mind. Even this eminent monk needed some time to digest and sort them out. In addition, the monk clearly knew that there was a relationship between him and Sudbai, at least in this story world. A kind of disadvantage, or it cannot be called a disadvantage, is called unequal access to information. Dabai, please tell me first. The fat man squatted down, stretched out one hand, and took one of Gyatso's bones in his hand. Gyatso was both a Buddha and a demon, and his bones seemed to have been forged. There is a dark black and gold intertwined luster deep inside, giving people a very indestructible feeling. But even so, when he died before, it was so simple and straightforward. Until now, Fatty has not completely escaped from the scene of witnessing Gyatso's death just now. The monk let out a breath of filthy breath. He sat cross-legged and looked around. Finally, his eyes fell on Sudbai again. Your 30 years of radiation are not at all because of the piece of skin on your shoulder, right? It seemed that the three of them had not fully recovered and were still a little shaken, so when the monk asked this question, he unconsciously took on an aggressive attitude. This kind of thing is rare for monks. Of course, Sudbai didn't. He doesn't care about this because he is actually very uneasy right now. Without answering the monk's question directly, Sudbai first said to the fat man, "You said that Munan is an old yinbai. I believe it now." He can think about the true nature of all this situation in such a short period of time, and at the same time, he dug a big hole for us. This kind of person is really terrible. In fact, this kind of person is a level higher than a monk. Even the pressure and calculating feeling given to Sudbai by a monk are not as shocking as what Munan showed so easily. I have experienced a story world before. In that story world, I came into contact with Sophia for the first time. Oh, by the way, and you, Fatty, do you still remember that story world? The dense jungle and huts, the winding creek and the black owner of the convenience store at the entrance to the road. The fat man was startled. In that story world, Fatty was initially with Yigu, and both of them subconsciously gave up on Sudbai, who was just an experiencer at the time. But in the end, Sudbai gained a lot from that story world, while Fatty himself was I gained very little, and I died in that story world. From Fatty's point of view, if he hadn't died that time, that guy might be a senior person now. Obviously, the monk didn't know about this, so he seemed a little depressed at this time. The unequal access to information made the monk feel more and more irritable. He hated this feeling, really hated it. But at the same time, the monk began to recite the pure heart mantra in his heart. The smart thing about smart people is actually to control themselves to do the right things at the right time and the right place. You mean, the principle of this story world is the same as last time? The fat man took a deep breath and pointed at himself. Am I in a certain cycle now? Then, the fat man pointed at Gyatso again, and Gyatso will reappear alive and kicking in the next cycle? Then we will collectively act like idiots and not remember what happened before. Sudbai nodded, then shook his head. It looks similar, but it should be different. Raising the firefighting suit in his hand, Sudbai put it on. After he was dressed neatly, Sudbai pointed to his chest. I don't know where this blood came from, but I know that if it's that simple in the cycle of reincarnation, this pool of blood cannot appear here. Judging from the location of the blood, you should have been attacked at that time, and the wound was on your chest, the monk said at this time, and you, when we first entered the story world, you were radiated. He almost had only one breath left, and his body was covered in pustules. Why is this? The fat man scratched his hair, somewhat incomprehensible. Sudbai looked around. He was wearing a firefighting suit, and most of his body was hidden under the firefighting suit. Let me take another look. Sudbai once again walked beside the firefighting suits beside him. The firefighting suits were neatly folded and placed here, and it was impossible for Sudbai to flip them. Seem. If you touch a firefighting suit that does not belong to you, you will suffer terrible punishment and become like Gyatso. But fortunately, the three audience members had their firefighting suits in their hands and opened them when they died, so there were many more places to observe. Finally, Subai saw a bead-like scorch mark on an unfolded fireman's suit. There were some lines on the scorch mark. "Monk, come here and see if these are the marks left on your relic," Subai asked. The monk immediately stood up and walked over. After some observation, the monk nodded, "Amidba, it's almost the same, but this may not be the fire uniform of a poor monk." "Yes, it may be caused by you using the relic to hit others," Subai said. The monk's eyes slowly scanned each piece of firefighting uniform, his eyes bright. The fat man also came over at this time, and said somewhat absurdly, "Dabai, you mean, every listener actually has the corresponding fire uniform that they have worn before?" "Yes, so although I don't know how Munan determined which one belonged to him, he deliberately prayed in Korean even though he knew it," Subai said. The fat man continued, "That old Yinbai deliberately made us think that these fire uniforms were actually left by the firefighters who died here before, thinking that we wanted to gain the approval of those firefighters from them. Get permission to get the fire suit in hand and move on to the next level. But in fact, his real purpose is to trap all of us to death? So why was the main mission part blurred when the mission was announced on the radio?" The fat man pursed his lips, and a cold feeling of terror spread throughout his body. The monk sighed and said slowly, "Because we have received the mission a long time ago." Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 544. Because we have received the mission a long time ago. No one present, whether it was Subai, the monk, or the fat man, was stupid. Although they would also feel shocked at the sudden cold turn of events, and they would also feel their inner emotions at the sudden turn of events. Of uneasiness and fear. But these are just human nature, and there is no way to erase their excellence and excellence. Yes, imagine a picture. Subai, who was wearing a firefighting suit, spread out his hands and pointed around. "In this picture, there are me, you, Fatty, Gyatso, Sophia, and dozens of other listeners, all standing here, looking at the cylindrical building in front of them. Then, we put on the firefighting suits in front of us. The image of dozens of listeners standing here in firefighting uniforms does seem a bit exaggerated, even a bit unacceptable, because everyone's memory does not have the scene at all, but now they are starting to make up their minds. Because the three people present all know that in the story world, the first thing you have to do is to smash your original understanding of the world and need it for later use, because radio is always happy with this method. It likes to see the shock and astonishment of its audience, and takes pleasure in doing so. At that time, the main mission should have been released." Subai raised his head and looked at the bloody full moon in the sky. When the broadcast was stopped for the first time and corrected, it was mainly to solve the problem that could be solved in the story world. The bosses who discovered the existence of broadcasting and stubbornly went against it. Those bosses in the story world deliberately violated the arrangements of broadcasting, deliberately let things go, and even risked their own demise in order to have a confrontation with broadcasting. But after the first suspension, this kind of thing never happened again. Subai lowered his head and said calmly, "As for the second suspension, we thought at first that it was because the radio was trying to cope with the returning audience, but in fact, the radio didn't need to go through such a big effort at all, or even have to. For this reason, we stopped broadcasting for 3 months as a matter of caution, because only a few dead people came back, and I don't believe that the broadcaster didn't know about it in advance, otherwise there would be no existence of those puppets on the train." So, Subai, what you are saying is that the second suspension of broadcasting is actually a second correction of what was corrected in the first suspension, the monk said. Subai nodded and said, "Broadcasting has been trying to make the story world and plot more interesting, but because of the first revision, if the indigenous existences in the story world were to, if they set it too strong, it will lead to them seeing through the nature of the world and then going against the broadcast. This will actually affect the storytelling requirements of the broadcast to a certain extent. But think about it on the other hand, if the indigenous people in the story world are too weak, then the broadcaster will naturally have to use his own ability to set up some restrictions to forcibly create dangers and variables. In this case, firstly, it is a lot more deliberate, and secondly, it loses the uncertainty that can be formed by the interaction between the story world itself and the audience. To a certain extent, it is also the nature of the story. Have you noticed that after the first broadcast was suspended and revised, the subsequent story world has actually become dominated by rules and competition between listeners? The broadcaster personally set up an arena for listeners to fight, but there is no longer the kind of audience that can it's time to independently explore the story world and connect the plot with the indigenous people. So, according to what you said, who are the real indigenous people in this story world? The monk asked as he turned his head and looked at the cylindrical building in front of him, which looked like a huge chimney. Buildings, in fact, the monk already knew the answer. It's quite interesting to think about it. According to the opening words of the announcer when the broadcast pulled us into the world of the story, the broadcast may be trying to show us a thing we have never imagined, the core. Dabai, according to what you and the monk said before, does it mean that Gyatso is not truly dead? The fat man continued to hold Gyatso's bones in his hand. The monk sighed at this time and said, in the world of stories, it is impossible to have an infinite loop system like movies and TV series, because the attitude of radio towards listeners is ultimately like cultivating worms. There will definitely be someone in the loop. Be eliminated. Having said this, the monk held a Buddhist bead and his eyes looked a little deep. As for how to be eliminated, and who to choose to be eliminated, the possible answer is that in the building in front, we don't know where our fire suits are. One piece, so, Fatty, neither you nor I may be able to go in. Although Fatty himself had guessed these circumstances and details, it was obvious that Fatty was still worried about not being able to enter. Since it was the first time that everyone went in wearing firefighting suits, it was obvious that the firefighting suits were used to enter that building. Although Munan wanted to deceive others before, he still went in wearing a firefighting suit. If the firefighting suit did not belong to him, he would turn into corpses and fall to the ground. But I'm really unwilling, the fat man said angrily. Yes, he was very unwilling. Now he really can only stay here and wait for death, but can't do anything. Even though Fatty didn't have that kind of hatred towards Subai, he still felt very unwilling to see Subai find his own firefighting suit, put it on and then enter the building. The fat man didn't do much to hide his emotions. At this time, there were only 3 people left here, and there was really no need to hide anything. The monk said meaningfully. The poor monk now feels that Subai is different from us. He does not enter the story world with a brand new attitude, but looks like he has been over-radiated and is waiting for us in this story world. This may not be without our efforts. After all, according to common sense, at the beginning of the mission, everyone was standing here in firefighting suits. The 4 of us must have stood closer together. Obviously, you and Gyatso all came with a completely new attitude, thinking that it was the first time they entered the story world and were still waiting for the main mission. This can actually mean that we are actually dead in the first round. Since we are dead, then the person who is preserved in the way of being irradiated must bear the meaning of our death. The monk's words were very subtle, but very reasonable. Then, I'm going in, Subai said. What are you going to do? Are you going to try your luck at choosing a firefighting suit, or are you going to continue sitting here? Choosing the wrong fire uniform can mean death. The monk shook his head. Although sitting here is a very meaningless thing, I still feel that it is better not to die in this reincarnation easily. Subai nodded, turned around, and walked towards the cylindrical building in front. When he saw Subai's figure disappearing through the door, the fat man's breathing suddenly became heavier and he pointed at the door. "Monk, if you go in without wearing a firefighting suit, will you really die instantly? Or?" The monk glanced at the fat man and said, "If you touch a firefighting suit that is not your own, you will die immediately. Are you still going to try it?" The fat man hesitated for a moment, but finally shook his head. The further he walked inside, the distorted feeling became heavier and heavier. Munan had to use his hands to hold onto the wall to keep moving forward. He knew clearly that this was due to his vision, touch, center of gravity and sense of direction. The cause of the imbalance. The surrounding light also began to flicker. Finally, Munan walked out of the narrow and long corridor. At this time, his face had turned pale white. He knew that he still needed some time to get used to it. For a senior person, the intensity of radiation inside could have an impact that was visible to the naked eye, instead of the subtle influence it had before outside. At the bottom, there is a relatively spacious circular space. In the center is a high platform. On the high platform, there is a concentrated black liquid that does not look like a liquid or a solid. It is constantly expanding and contracting like a human heart. The scorching heat is constantly radiating from it. Next to this thing, there are figures shaped by black light. Some of these people have been seen by Munan, and some have not. Among the figures he has seen, there are many who he killed in the encounter before entering the nuclear power plant. He even saw the 4 previous teammates in his team and the monk. The 3 white men were obviously alive. They should be the first team to enter the nuclear power plant and come here. Among them, 1 white man is relatively thin, the other is relatively tall, and the third one is standing between the two. His whole body is covered with festering blisters, and pus is constantly dripping from his body. He looks very ugly. It's disgusting, as if it has been radiated for many years. The 3 white men were all standing in front of a figure, placing their hands inside the figure, as if they were absorbing and reading something. It seemed that Munan's arrival had disturbed them. The white man in the middle with ulcers all over his body turned around, his face was almost a piece of rotten flesh, facing Munan, and said in a hoarse voice, "Haha, I'm really surprised. I thought it was him coming, but I didn't expect, it's actually you. You are really smart. Just like you did the first time, you are so smart that it makes people feel scary." There was not much surprise on Munan's face, and he just asked calmly, "From the number, size, distribution, and many other details of the team, we can actually infer where we are now and what state we are in. You don't need to explain to me." The rotten flesh on the white man's face squirmed. "It's a pity that wisdom cannot be absorbed here. Otherwise, I really want you to die outside, so that I can have one more person here choice. You know, you are indispensable to the fact that we were able to get here the first time. Then I'm curious, how did I die last time?" Munan asked seriously. He felt that he was fully capable and confident, and should be able to take advantage of the last time. But obviously, that was not the case. This time, he started with the memory of just entering this story world. Yes, this also means that in the last episode, he died. If Munan hadn't been smart enough, if he hadn't deduced the nature of the story world at this time through some clues in time, then he might have become one of the figures under this black light now. The white man seemed to be smiling, but because his facial features were completely distorted, it was impossible to tell whether he was actually smiling. Every time, in a reincarnation, the dead person will transform into a shadow and appear here, and those who can come here will have the opportunity to imitate one of their enhancements, and the absorbed figure corresponds to that person will die completely and will no longer appear in the next reincarnation. Just now, 5 new figures appeared. This must have something to do with you. Haha, you surprised me. You can deliberately trick so many people to death without knowing the situation here. I have to thank you. Munan walked up to the black shadow of Monk Fan, Gyatso, and stretched out his hand to put it on. But at the same time, he still stared at the white man and asked. "You haven't told me how I died last time." "Ha, another Chinese bit your neck with his teeth." "Well, he finally came down, haha, we met again, but you came down so slowly. I think it should be radiation damage. As a result, your memory is incomplete, he he he." Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 545. Unlike Munan, who was very uncomfortable when he walked over, Subai felt that although he could clearly feel that the surrounding radiation was getting stronger and stronger, and it had reached a terrifying level, it was still within the range that he could barely bear, without causing any other obvious discomfort. This may be because he has experienced radiation, so his body's ability to withstand radiation has been strengthened. The human body is considered very weak even in modern social cognition. In terms of speed, it cannot compare with a leopard, and in terms of strength, it cannot compare with a lion. In nature, if humans do not use external objects, they will probably become nothing more than a delicious meal for those true carnivores. But in fact, the human body's ability to self-repair and self-evolve is indeed very obvious. For example, after experiencing some epidemic diseases once, your body will produce antibodies, and the probability of getting the disease again is very low. In fact, Subai felt that if human beings had not embarked on the path of relying on scientific and technological development to arm themselves and neglected to develop and utilize their own potential, perhaps the things that these listeners have been strengthened now, human beings would have been able to rely on their own exploration and generations of genetic improvement to get. Of course, if you look at the conclusions about broadcasting and atavism that I discussed with the monk before, in fact, most of the current broadcasts except for technological enhancements, the rest, such as lineage, profession, etc., only appear in myths and legends. Everything in the world was actually owned by humans before the Qin dynasty. Subai's eyes wandered around first, and finally landed on the white man who was talking to him. At the first sight of this white man, Subai felt that he was very familiar, but not familiar with the other person. But for the other person's current physical state. At the beginning, he was also like this. His whole body was severely ulcerated due to radiation, and he was almost dying. The man in front of him was obvious and similar, but his eyes hidden in the rotten flesh exuded, with a profound and incomparable light. Bringing people here very early, in front of everyone, according to what this white man said to himself before, does this really mean that the other party does retain more memories about the last time than he does? After all, Subai only had some memory images in his mind. He used to think that the broadcast did this intentionally, but now it seems that those images are left by him, but he does not seem to really remember the important images, otherwise he would not have been confused for so long. Munan's hand was placed on Gyatso's shadow. When he saw Subai coming in, he didn't say anything, but just started to concentrate on absorbing Gyatso. Obviously, there are many questions here. There are also many unknowns here. In fact, there must be a big crisis hidden. But at this time, most people are immersed in plundering the rest of the audience. This is an irresistible temptation and a gluttonous feast. Maybe, only this white man can know more about things, but since he and his friends are doing these things, I guess he is not immune. Hurry up, the white man looked at Subai and reminded, one reincarnation can only absorb the enhancement of one deceased person. The person who has been enhanced will not appear in the next reincarnation and is considered a complete death. This is a good meal for broadcasting arrangements, a redistribution of resources. The two white men finished absorbing it, and the two shadows in front of them immediately dissipated. The white man whose body was full of ulcers just now turned back and continued to absorb his target. Three white men communicated in English with some American English accents. It seemed that these three people should be listeners from the United States. The man with ulcers all over his body was called George by his companions. Inside the building, along with the great mystery, listeners who might have been trying to trick each other outside before. At this time, it seemed particularly harmonious and peaceful, as if they were just a group of diners who met in a buffet restaurant. Although they were not so enthusiastic that they would get together to drink and brag, they could at least maintain a relative quietness and freedom. Anyway, the choice here. There are still many. After all, there are quite a few dead listeners. As Munan absorbed it, the color of Gyatso's shadow was significantly reduced, and at this time, Munan felt Subai coming to his side. Originally, Munan thought that Subai would choose to absorb the shadow next to him, which was the shadow of a Japanese female ninja. Munan really didn't think about any surprises. Generally speaking, any listener with a normal mind should make the same choice when faced with this situation and choice. Being able to have the opportunity to directly obtain the enhancement from a senior person is almost like pie in the sky. However, soon, Munan was stunned. He sensed that Subai's energy was completely locked on his body. "You are not allowed to absorb this," Subai said coldly. George had also just absorbed a phantom, which also meant that the three listeners would die completely and would never have another chance to be reincarnated. Seeing the two Chinese people Subai and Munan stalemate there, George felt a little complicated. In a daze, he suddenly felt that the predatory nature of the weak and the strong in the story world did not seem to be the most important aspect this time. The most important aspect actually lay on another level. For example, George remembered that the last time, the people who finally came here were himself and these two Chinese people. When maybe a few dozen audience members came in wearing firefighting suits, for some reason, everyone got crazy and started killing, barely able to survive. The reason is probably that you will not take action against people you know and subconsciously feel you can trust. It was a bloody scene. A terrible scene. Even George, he survived because of great luck. All three of them staggered here with serious injuries. After the killing was over, the madness and dread that lingered in their minds also disappeared. It was supposed to be a perfect moment to choose food, but for some unknown reason, the two Chinese started a new round of fighting under the influence of outsiders who were no longer in a state of madness. This directly led to George himself not having the chance to successfully absorb the enhancement of a phantom, because when the two Chinese were fighting beside him, he simply did not dare to immerse his mind in other places. Go, otherwise you may be killed and become one of the many phantoms. In the second reincarnation, I had a huge advantage. I personally brought two friends who were also in the American audience circle to get here first. All three of them also gained the reinforcement they wanted. Two Chinese people actually came in. You know, one of the Chinese people died in the last time, so he entered this reincarnation with a new mentality of entering the story world, while the other Chinese person didn't seem to have the right magic weapon to do it. Preserve his memory to the greatest extent. In other words, his memory is damaged. At the same time, he should be like himself in this reincarnation, with abscesses all over his body and being tortured horribly by radiation. But he recovered and entered again. I have to say that even George himself admires these two Chinese people. They are really outstanding. However, it seems that history is repeating itself again at this time, and they are on the road again. In the two reincarnations, is there something controlling all of this? As soon as he thought about it, George felt a great sense of horror. He didn't dare to think about it anymore. If he thought about it anymore, it would involve that terrible thing, which is cause and effect. Obviously, George is not willing to get involved in that field at this time. He still wants to live well. No matter how attractive and fascinating that field is, it is nothing compared to his own life. Importance, cause and effect, is Pandora's box. Looking up and looking at the black concentrated ball-like suspension in the center, George thought that it was about to explode, and the next reincarnation was about to begin. And the two Chinese people arrived late. Now that they are at a stalemate again, there is probably not enough time to absorb any shadow for them. Thinking of this, George felt a lot more at ease. He admitted that these two Chinese people were very good. Even in the senior sequence, they were definitely figures in the pyramid position of this level. However, the three of them each absorbed a virtual figure this time. After the shadow, she will gradually reveal her absolute strength, and then everyone here will become a stepping stone for the three of them. Perhaps, the broadcaster wants to use this non-wasteful method in this story world to forcibly stack up several powerful listeners to impact the rank of high-level listeners. George took out a black bead from his arms. There was an eye in the bead, with an eerie aura. He handed the bead to a person next to him. "Stephen, last time my body barely blocked the terrible radiation caused by the explosion, but this time, I obviously can't survive in this state. Take the Eye of Darkness, it can protect you. The memory will not be erased and diluted in the radiation. When you are reincarnated next time, you will be responsible for finding me and Mikiri. The three of us will, like this time, be the first to enter before other listeners can react. Here, foraging takes place. We will become stronger and stronger." Stephen, who looked a little thin, took the dark demon eye and nodded with a very solemn expression. At this time, George suddenly thought of the North Korean woman. The North Korean woman also had a skill and was able to survive the terrible melee by feigning death. But she was also unlucky. When she crawled here dying, the ball exploded. She should be like herself. In this reincarnation she was also in a terrible state of ulcers all over her body, but she was not as lucky as herself, and she did not have the ability of the Chinese to continue to come here even if her memory was damaged. In fact, the shadow of a North Korean woman was one of the first to appear here. It was obvious that she died very early. "I didn't expect you to value friendship so much, but you have to understand that the reinforcement of this monk is what I need most." Munan stared at Subai and said coldly. "I just don't want that guy to die so simply and cowardly." Subai and Munan looked at each other. "I think if I change places with him at this time, he will do the same as me. Of course, you can make a choice, either fight with me here and be taken advantage of by those Americans, or you can change." Okay, remember, in the next reincarnation, I will kill you first." Munan turned around, preparing to choose another one. However, at this moment, the black ball in the center slowly began to split, a terrible feeling of heat began to be transmitted, and the surrounding space seemed to be distorted to a certain extent at this time. "This is..." Munan's face twisted almost with anger. Of course he knew what was going to happen. He was very aggrieved. He had time to absorb the enhancement of the monk, but because of Subai's obstruction, he failed to succeed, and this failure almost means that in this reincarnation, all his efforts have been ridiculously useless. "Oh, it's going to explode," Subai said calmly. "You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment." Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 546. The ball in the center has begun to tremble, as if the volcano is accumulating and suppressing before erupting. There was a look of fear on George's face. Apparently, the feeling of being tortured by strong radiation in the last reincarnation was still fresh in his memory. Moreover, unlike Subai had no memory. Naturally he does not have such painful memories, but he, George, does. Although he did feel worried and disappointed when he handed over his precious magic weapon, the Eye of the Dark Demon, to Stephen, in fact, in George's heart, he was more of a blessing. He knew that his body could not withstand another round of radiation, but why couldn't he feel comfortable in avoiding this painful torture? This is definitely not a comfortable job. According to what the American said, this is the second time you have broken my good deeds. Munan stared at Sudbai fiercely. The feeling of deep hatred and hatred was clearly visible at this time, and his whole body's energy also emanated, forming a tit-for-tat aura with Sudbai. Sudbai's indifferent and calm posture seemed to stimulate him further. The next moment, Munan's left arm turned into a tentacle in an instant, and his eyes also released a light blue light, rushing directly towards Sudbai. Sudbai's body tensed up instantly, and he took the initiative to attack. When the two sides touched each other, they clashed hard again and again, causing the circular area to reverberate with ear-splitting roars. "Let's get out of here first," George said to Mikari. "Let's go." "Is there any difference between here and outside?" Mikari asked. "The difference," George poked Mikari's chest with his hand, "the radiation concentration here is not actually the highest, it is outside. If you are outside, you will definitely die. Here, I will definitely die now. And you should not be in a state where you can only take your last breath and then have pus all over your body. Then all your memories will basically disappear. Like me, you will think that you are entering the story world for the first time, but you are different from me. My strength and everything will be restored, and you will become full-body ulcers. His miserable appearance will not be our helper but will only become our burden. This time, I am a burden and you are my assistant. Next time, do you want one person to take care of two burdens? If something happens and they are intercepted, it will be all over." After understanding what George meant, Mikari stopped saying anything and walked towards the corridor with George. They were not going to escape, but to seek death. This sounds strange, but it is also a way to adapt to local conditions. Way of doing. When standing at the entrance of the corridor, George hesitated and looked over there. The two Chinese were still fighting. Haha, did these two Chinese really have inextricable hatred and debts? Twice. It's all like this. Chinese. I really like infighting. George put aside his last concern and walked into the corridor with Mikari. About half a minute before George and Mikari walked into the corridor, Sudbai and Munan, who were still fighting just now, stopped their movements in an instant. Both sides were wearing colorful clothes, and they looked like they were fighting to the death before, but now, their calmness seemed very strange. Stephen, who was standing in the distance and did not follow George and the others, had been observing the fight between the two Chinese. Just as he was watching with relish, the two Chinese suddenly stopped. Stephen immediately secretly screamed something bad. At this time, Munan and Sudbai separated instantly and rushed towards Stephen together. Stephen clutched the eye of the dark demon with one hand. Of course he knew how precious the eye of the dark demon was. This was something the three of him could rely on to complete the game of big fish eating small fish step by step in this story world. And the key to always standing at the top of the food chain. Munan's tentacles instantly became very long and swept directly towards Stephen. Naturally, Stephen would not stand here stupidly and not know how to resist. In fact, having just received reinforcement from an audience, he could also realize that his current strength has increased. The increase in strength will inevitably be accompanied by an increase in self-confidence. Roar! A wolf howl came from Stephen's throat. His body suddenly swelled up, his skin turned dark green, and his face gradually twisted into a werewolf appearance. Stephen, who was originally thin and short, suddenly became a muscular werewolf at this time. Boom! Stephen's wolf arm directly collided with Munan's tentacle. In an instant, sparks flew everywhere. Then, Stephen grabbed Munan's tentacle with his backhand and pulled it towards him. Munan's eyes narrowed slightly, and his body was subconsciously pulled over, but his tentacles directly turned into the most vicious and highly corrosive blood, which fell on Stephen's body just right. Even the werewolf's physical defense seemed a little overwhelmed by the sudden corrosive liquid comparable to aqua regia, and he let out a scream and began to retreat. At this time, Sudbai also approached, and slammed his shoulder into Stephen, who was retreating. Stephen's body twisted at this time, and brown hair grew all over his body. He changed his previous image of a werewolf, but he was still so tall and looked like a brown bear. Subai remembered this scene. This was the strengthening of Sutton, the strong white man who was with Sophia before. Sutton was killed by Subai himself. Apparently, it was Sutton who Stephen had absorbed before. Shadow. Boom. The two actually collided with each other, and both sides bounced back together. It was almost an even fight, but Stephen was more embarrassed than Subai. Rise. Munan raised his hands. The blood that had been spilled on Stephen's body suddenly became more active, and bloody tentacles that looked like worms began to scurry around Stephen's body. Stephen's body was trembling constantly under this pain. At this time, Subai came over again, and Stephen barely punched him, but at this time, even though he looked like a terrifying brown bear, but in the face of Munan's successive insidious moves, he seemed a little powerless. After his slap was blocked by Subai kicked him directly. Stephen flew backwards, like a kite with a broken string. At this time, Stephen began to scold George in his heart, "How could you just leave like this? How could you protect the Eye of Darkness by yourself?" Actually, you can't blame George, because in the last reincarnation, George watched Subai and Munan fight to the end, so this time when he saw them fighting there, George had preconceived ideas. Munan quickly walked around Stephen, stretched out a tentacle, and cut off one of Stephen's palms, causing the Eye of Darkness to fall freely. However, a blood mist suddenly enveloped him. Directly scraped away the Eye of Darkness. Stephen fell heavily to the ground, one of his hands was cut off, countless bones in his body were broken, and his skin was full of pitted and corroded wounds, even though he still had the strength to stand up. But in fact he himself also knew that there was no way he could take the Eye of the Dark Demon from the hands of the two Chinese. These two Chinese are really cunning. Munan's whole body burst into red light, and began to entangle with Subai's blood mist. To the end. The Eye of the Dark Demon was held between Subai and Munan with 2 fingers each, and neither of them relaxed. Before, the conflict between the two was because Subai did not allow Munan to absorb Gyatso, causing Munan to gain nothing again in this reincarnation. Munan was really angry, and the confrontation between the two was not a lie, but then when George and the two left, the two people immediately stopped and came to snatch things in a tacit understanding. They don't know what the Eye of the Dark Demon is, but they know that there must be something in that person that can preserve the memory from being diluted by radiation. Whoever has this can take the absolute initiative in the next reincarnation, because everyone has people around them who can win over, and then they can come in early with the advantage of a prophet to absorb the reinforcement of the dead audience. Boom. The black ball in the center exploded at this time, and terrible radiation began to emit. In this circular area, the radiation is significantly reduced, because the bodies of the monk, Fatty, George, Mikari, and more people outside were decomposed almost instantly. It turned into tiny particles and dissipated in the wind. As for Subai and Munan inside, as well as Stephen who was lying there and hadn't gotten up yet, their bodies began to slowly turn white, then black, and then their skin slowly swelled. Obviously, everyone's time running out. Give this to me. I'll come find you in the next reincarnation, Munan said to Subai. Very good, but can you reverse it? A smile appeared at the corner of Subai's mouth. This Munan is still playing tricks up to now. Now the black ball has exploded. Even if he goes out now, it will be too late. By then, if he doesn't have the Eye of Dark Demon, he will be the next one. In reincarnation it will be exactly the same as this time. And this Munan, a person who died in the last reincarnation, can actually find his way in this reincarnation. Such a person is definitely more threatening than the 3 Americans before. In fact, Subai could imagine that if there was the Eye of the Dark Demon, This guy would have the skills and scheming to put everyone here under his feet and become his own person. There's no time, Munan urged. Yes, there is no time, Subai said. It has exploded. Munan's flesh began to curl up and rot, and he pointed to the black ball in the center. What? It exploded. Subai pretended to be surprised, and then, Subai exerted force with both fingers. Boom. Eye of darkness. Broken. Munan. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 547. Boom. The eye of the dark demon shattered into pieces and turned directly into a piece of silver dust, which then dissipated. This magical weapon is powerful because of its special effects, but it itself is not very strong. After all, it is not a magical weapon used for combat like the Hellfire shotgun. At this time, Munan stared at the silver dust in front of him, his expression confused for a moment. This was not disguised or intentional, because at this time, there was no point in pretending anything. Munan actually had many possibilities in his mind before, and even wanted to tell Subai the deeper information he had discovered in order to meet the conditions in exchange for the eye of the dark demon. Because this story world, in Munan's opinion, cannot be said to simply provide a place for listeners to devour the powerful. This story world, the black ball that just burst, and the core that the broadcast wants to show, are actually not that simple. However, Munan never expected that Subai would crush the dark demon eye without taking it seriously. How could he do this? How could he do this? The terrible radiation has completely enveloped the two of them. Munan can no longer think too much, nor can he think too deeply. His vision has begun to blur, and the body's rejection reaction is also constantly strengthening. The entire figure, it's like being drunk, trying to stay awake has become a luxury. Subai was the same. Both men began to stagger. This was an unchangeable trend and an irresistible situation. In the face of this almost terrifying nuclear radiation. Personal. It seems so small. In the past, he felt that nuclear power plants were far away from him. Even before he became an audience, Subai thought that what he believed in more was science. Nuclear power plants, as long as they were not built in his own city, were not that scary. He used to travel to Japan. At that time, he visited the memorial hall about the atomic bomb explosion. But at that time, although Subai was shocked by the horrific scene of the mess after the use of the atomic bomb, it was hard to say that he had too much personal experience. The emotional tendencies of the Chinese people bring more of a sense of revenge to the fact that the Americans dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. Even though I had endured this kind of torture once in my last reincarnation, my memory had basically disappeared after all, so this time, it was almost not much different from the first time I faced it. This kind of despair, the decay from soul to body, seems to plunge people into a bottomless abyss. You don't know how much distance below is the ground, and you don't know how much distance around you is the wall. It's left to you. Just a desperate blackness. Breathe. Can't breathe anymore. Every pore in his body seemed to be closed at this time. From his soul to his body, he was completely suffocated. In the corridor, those farther away from the black ball seemed to be able to get some fresh air. This is a kind of torture more terrible than death. It can destroy your sanity and all your self-righteousness. Perseverance, bravery, and fearlessness of death seemed to be a pale joke in front of it. Stephen's body was entangled with werewolf and werewolf enhancements. At this time, it was impossible to tell whether he was a werewolf or a werewolf. This was a manifestation of radiation forcibly distorting the bloodline in the body. Vomit. Stephen opened his mouth, and a large pool of blood turbid substance spit out from his mouth. He stumbled towards the corridor almost hysterically. Go out. Leave here. Fresh air. Breathe. Munan was the same. He pinched his neck with one hand, and his handsome face was twisted to an abominable level. At this time, He had no trace of the Schulinfen and the composure he had before. Everything was calculated. He stood up in a hurry and pushed. He drove Stephen and rushed outside. Sudbai stood there. This terrible pain seemed to vaguely overlap with his vague memory from last time. The painful feeling was very clear and profound. Sudbai was also walking out. However, when Sudbai held onto the wall of the corridor and walked out, he suddenly felt a trance in his mind. Looking at it this way, it was his first time to see the coffin in the prop shop. Here, is it also for this reason? Because he was standing in this circular underground area when the black ball exploded, he was not killed directly. However, when faced with the painful torture, he was almost instinctively driven to move away from the black ball, even if he was far away from the black ball. An extra centimeter is also good. When Sudbai walked out of the cylindrical building in an almost dazed state, he saw the 20-some floating firefighting suits outside. Sudbai's own firefighting suit also automatically detached and merged into it, but there were 3 of them. The firefighting suit automatically incinerated into ashes. This means that the 3 listeners have died and will not appear in the next reincarnation. In front, Stephen and Munan were no longer visible. Sudbai staggered forward like a zombie. When he reached the entrance of the nuclear power plant, Sudbai staggered and fell down. There was a footprint on the cement floor next to Sudbai's head. Before, the English word out should have been written here, but it was erased by himself. At this time, Sudbai saw that the sunken position had been restored. As it is, the footprints have disappeared, and even the English words have disappeared. It seems that everything has been rearranged. A new reincarnation has actually begun at this time. If you leave a mark at this time, it will never disappear again. Sudbai instinctively wanted to reach out and write something down, but the painful feeling made him let out a weak roar, folded his arms, climbed up, and fled outside, as if running away. It wasn't that Sudbai didn't want to grit his teeth and leave something behind, but that Sudbai felt that he couldn't leave too detailed aura at this time. He couldn't help himself, and his whole thinking began to fall into a kind of chaos. What he thought in his mind was more of an instinct, a way to write out or go to prevent himself from doing it again in the future. The instinct to stay close to this place, even if you die happily outside, is like coming in and enduring this kind of torture. But this instinct is something Sudbai needs to restrain. Even if he can't leave a useful message to himself in the future, is it because he is afraid of suffering pain and giving the opposite message? This is not what Sudbai wants, nor is it what Sudbai wants to do. Even if he is really in pain now, just like a child who almost drowned, he will keep telling his friends not to go swimming in the future. The feeling of drowning is really terrifying. What Sudbai was doing now was to fight against his instinctive fear. He gritted his teeth. Sudbai's consciousness completely sank. He went crazy and ran away with his hands and feet like a wild animal. On the ground, leaving there were puddles of yellow and green pus, but the pus was destined to dissipate immediately. He didn't know how long he had been running, but Sudbai, whose eyes turned completely white, finally couldn't run anymore. In front of him, he saw the sea, and to the side, there was a street. Gilug. Sudbai's throat kept bubbling with acid, and his whole body was bleeding with pus. He was very miserable. Sudbai was still walking subconsciously while stumbling. Stay away from that. Further. Further away. Finally, with a sudden glance, Sudbai saw the vampire coffin placed in the center of the prop shop. An unknown feeling of familiarity stimulated Sudbai and attracted Sudbai to walk inside. Crash. A row of glass cos props were knocked to the ground by Sudbai and shattered into pieces, making a crisp interlacing sound. It seemed that in the midst of this crisp sound, Sudbai's consciousness suddenly paused, and a brief moment of clarity appeared in his white eyes, but soon, this moment of clarity also disappeared. He is tired. I am also in so much pain that I can't help myself. Squeak. The vampire coffin was opened by Subai, and then Subai lay down in it with his body covered in pus. Click. The vampire coffin lost its support and closed automatically. Everything fell into silence. I really hope this is the end, this is the end. There seems to be a certain number somewhere, but this so-called certain number, at least in this story world, seems a bit too deliberate. This is actually not a real world. Therefore, everything that has happened, and everything that will happen again, will be forcibly distorted to be exactly the same as before, every plant, every tree, every trace, with a touch of stubbornness, and naturally there will be an extra point. Deliberately. At least. This story world is still very different from the story world with a black convenience store owner that Subai has experienced before, because it is not completely formatted, but retains the interspersion between the previous reincarnation and this reincarnation, and its so-called reincarnation seems to ignore a very serious issue. That is, things are different and people are different. His horrible things still retain their terrible nature. And human beings will make progress. For example, for diseases. For example, for radiation. After experiencing a terrible radiation exposure, Subai's body was actually no longer what it was before. At this moment, Subai, who was lying quietly in the coffin, suddenly opened his eyes, clenching his fists tightly, and his white eyes, even though the pupils could not be seen clearly, still showed a kind of hysterical ferocity. The body is trembling slightly, and every muscle and even every cell in the body is transmitting a terrible painful feeling at this time, forcing the subject's consciousness to return to sleep again. Because of the resistance of the consciousness, it only brought endless pain and torture. A drop of blood seeped out from Subai's white eyes, slipped from the corner of his eyes, and dripped on the side of Subai's face. It seemed that Subai had exhausted all his strength. Next moment, he completely fainted. Fell into deep sleep.